What if I told you there once lived two sisters who made a vow to never speak to the world? Not a word to their parents, not to their teachers, not to anyone but each other. What if I told you their silence wasn't defiance, but a prison of their own design? This isn't a ghost story. It's a true account of one of the most haunting psychological cases ever recorded. A tale of obsession, identity, and the terrifying bond between two minds that refuse to separate. In the quiet town of Haverfordwest, Wales, June and Jennifer Gibbons were born in 1963 to Caribbean immigrant parents. They were identical twins, inseparable, uncanny in how they mirrored one another's movements, words, and emotions. But from early childhood, something about them unsettled those around them. Their teachers noticed that the girls rarely spoke, and when they did, it was only to each other, in a language no one else could understand. It wasn't nonsense. It was real speech, rapid, rhythmic, and secret. A language only they shared, evolved from English and Barbadian Creole, twisted by years of isolation. When forced to talk to others, their mouths froze. Their eyes darted in panic. Silence became their armor. The Gibbons twins grew up surrounded by whispers, possessed, mentally disturbed, cursed. Yet psychologists would later describe something much darker. The twins didn't simply choose silence. It was as if their identities had fused together so tightly that neither could exist without the other. Their world had only two inhabitants, June and Jennifer. Everyone else, family, friends, society, was on the outside. But when the world tried to separate them, it only made them stronger and more dangerous. But when the world tried to separate them, it only made them stronger and more dangerous. By their teenage years, the twins' private games began to shift into obsession. They started writing diaries, filled with eerie reflections, fantasies, and jealousy. Each one believed the other controlled her fate. Each loved the other deeply, yet secretly wished the other dead. Behind closed doors, they played with life and death, rehearsing their own funerals, writing dark fiction about twins who destroyed each other. Their silence had become something else entirely, a pact of control, a ritual of madness that the outside world could neither break nor understand. What began as childhood isolation was evolving into psychological warfare between two souls trapped in one mirrored cage. By the late 1970s, the Gibbons twins had crossed an invisible threshold. Their silence was no longer just a habit. It had become an unbreakable ritual. The world outside their room faded into static. They would spend hours standing in front of a mirror, mimicking each other's gestures, faces, and breathing until even they could no longer tell who was real and who was reflection. Their parents, bewildered and helpless, tried to intervene. Therapy, speech specialists, even separate schooling. But every attempt to divide them ended in catastrophe. When June was forced to attend a different class, she stopped eating. When Jennifer was sent away to a separate dormitory, she fell into catatonic stillness. Teachers described them as statues made of fear. And yet, when reunited, they would erupt into laughter, whispering in that strange, musical code only they understood, the language that was both their salvation and their curse. Psychologists later termed it elective mutism, but this was far beyond any clinical label. They lived inside a private universe, where words were weapons, silence was protection, and the boundary between love and hate had completely dissolved. Even their parents began to fear them. The twins had stopped aging like other children. Their eyes grew darker, their expressions more hollow, their writing more violent. At night, the house would echo with the sound of typewriter keys. Both girls locked away, crafting stories about doomed heroines, jealous sisters, and deadly promises. Their fiction bled into reality. Their diaries, later uncovered, revealed chilling thoughts. We have become one. We are one body, but two souls. If one dies, the other must follow. In those pages, Jennifer confessed she sometimes thought June was a demon wearing her face. June, in turn, wrote that Jennifer's presence suffocates me like air too thick to breathe. This wasn't twinship anymore. It was possession, self-made and self-fed. They began to experiment with destruction, setting fires, stealing, testing limits. The silent twins who once whispered to each other began to whisper to chaos. By 1981, their world imploded. A small fire in a Pembrokeshire shop led to a string of arsons. The girls, just teenagers, were arrested. The police reports described them as eerily calm, unremorseful, still silent, two identical faces gazing forward like dolls carved from the same fear. When questioned, they refused to speak. Not to the officers, not to their parents, only to each other, whispering words that no one would ever decode. What happened next would mark their names forever in psychiatric history and expose the terrifying cost of being seen only as half of a whole. When June and Jennifer Gibbons were sentenced to Broadmoor Hospital in 1982, it wasn't a typical punishment. It was a life sentence for silence. Broadmoor was not a place for teenage girls. It was a fortress for the criminally insane. Concrete walls, locked doors, and corridors that echoed with the screams of the damned. Murderers, arsonists, and the violently disturbed filled its wards. And now, two quiet sisters from Wales had been placed among them. They were only 19 years old. Their crime, a series of arsons and thefts, had stemmed from boredom, frustration, and a desire to feel alive, as June later wrote. But inside Broadmoor, the silence that once protected them became their undoing. They refused to speak to staff, psychologists, or even guards. Only when alone together would they whisper, lips barely moving, in that strange private rhythm that no one could decipher. Doctors called it folie à deux, madness shared by two, a psychological bond so intense that both individuals lose touch with reality, feeding each other's delusions until they become one mind split in two bodies. June and Jennifer embodied this disorder perfectly. Every emotion one felt, the other mirrored. When June refused to eat, Jennifer did too. When Jennifer was sedated, June fell into unconsciousness. Their bodies and minds seemed intertwined, ruled by a dark and invisible agreement. One nurse described their presence as unnerving. They would sit side by side for hours, motionless, staring at the wall, until suddenly one would laugh, or cry, or begin whispering frantically as though speaking to unseen forces. Their diaries were filled with words like hate, love, death, and freedom. Jennifer once wrote, "We have decided. One of us must die so that the other may live." The doctors thought it metaphorical, the ramblings of confinement. But the twins knew what they meant. Broadmoor had become their purgatory. They had been locked away not just from the world, but from themselves. And somewhere in that silence, they reached an unthinkable decision. One of them would have to die for the other to be free. The staff didn't know it yet, but the countdown to tragedy had already begun, written in their journals, whispered in their code, and sealed in the strange, haunted eyes of two girls who had never truly belonged to this world. In Broadmoor's suffocating halls, June and Jennifer's lives became a theater of symmetry. One couldn't move without the other mirroring it. Guards watched as they walked the corridors in perfect rhythm, heads bowed, hair hanging like veils. They were inseparable, yet their unity was poisoned by resentment. Their diaries told the truth the world could not see. June wrote, "She is my shadow, and I cannot live without her, but I cannot live with her either." Jennifer's entries echoed, "One of us must go. There is no more space for both of us." As years passed, doctors noticed a terrifying shift. Jennifer began to weaken, physically, emotionally, almost spiritually. She moved slower, her voice grew softer, and her once piercing stare dimmed. June, in contrast, seemed to grow stronger, more articulate. It was as if their shared existence was draining one life to sustain the other. Some staff whispered that Jennifer had chosen to die, surrendering herself so June could finally live. Others believed they were playing a psychological game, that their pact was a delusion born of endless confinement. By 1993, after over a decade behind locked doors, the twins were finally deemed stable enough for transfer to a lower security facility. On the day of their release, they traveled together in a prison van, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Witnesses recall them holding hands, whispering softly, and Jennifer saying, I'm going to have to die now." Hours later, at the gates of the new hospital, Jennifer collapsed. She was rushed to the infirmary, but her heart had already stopped. There was no poison, no injury, no medical explanation. The cause of death was simply listed as acute myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. June's reaction chilled everyone. Instead of screaming or collapsing, she whispered calmly, "At last, I am free." For the first time in her life, she began to speak, clearly, fluently, as if a curse had been lifted. Jennifer's funeral was small. June attended alone, leaving a single note on her sister's grave: "We once were one. Now I stand alone." To this day, no one fully understands what happened between them, whether Jennifer's death was psychological surrender, supernatural connection, or pure coincidence. But those who met them in Broadmoor still speak of the twins in hushed tones, as if their silence still lingers in the air. Their story remains one of the most haunting psychological enigmas of the modern world, a tale not of ghosts or demons, but of two minds so intertwined that even death itself could only separate them for a moment. Before Broadmoor, before the tragedy, there were two little girls in a quiet Welsh town, June and Jennifer Gibbons, born to Caribbean immigrants in the 1960s. From the beginning, they were inseparable, like mirrors made flesh. But the world around them was not kind. Growing up as the only black children in a small, predominantly white community, they faced ridicule, exclusion, and cruelty from the moment they entered school. Children mocked their accents, their silence, their differences. Teachers described them as unresponsive, mute, and detached. In truth, the twins weren't mute. They were choosing not to speak. Their silence became a shield, a way to retreat from a world that had rejected them. At home, they developed their own private language, a rapid, whispered blend of English and Bajan Creole so complex that even their parents couldn't understand. They mimicked each other's movements, repeated each other's sentences, and moved in perfect synchrony. It wasn't just habit, it was survival. Their father, Aubrey, a technician for the Royal Air Force, and their mother, Gloria, tried desperately to get help. Speech therapists, psychologists, and teachers all failed to reach the girls. Each attempt to separate them resulted in violent breakdowns. June would collapse into seizures. Jennifer would scream uncontrollably. It was as if their souls had fused, bound by an invisible thread. Eventually, specialists decided to send them to separate boarding schools, hoping to break their dependence. But the plan only deepened the damage. Away from Jennifer, June fell into a near catatonic state, refusing to move, eat, or speak. When they were reunited months later, they didn't run into each other's arms. Instead, they stood silently face to face for hours, unblinking. Then, as if in agreement, they turned their backs on the world once again. By their teenage years, they lived almost entirely in isolation, locked in their bedroom, creating elaborate fantasy worlds through diaries, dolls, and stories. They wrote of fame, love, and violence, fantasies that blurred into obsession. Their notebooks contained entire novels filled with dark themes, betrayal, murder, and death. The girls were no longer just twins. They were authors, gods of their own secret universe. The line between fiction and reality was already fading, and neither one of them seemed to notice. By the late 1970s, the twins' fantasies had grown darker, more elaborate. Their diaries reveal an inner world teetering on madness, stories of doomed lovers, violent heroes, and betrayed sisters. Each girl wrote her own version of reality, but their tales always ended the same way, one twin dying for the other's freedom. It was as if they were scripting their destiny long before it unfolded. Trapped inside their small bedroom, the twins began to drift further into delusion. They built entire universes for their dolls, giving them names, families, and tragic fates. Every day became a performance, a ritual. They would speak only to each other, sometimes whispering for hours, sometimes not uttering a word. Outside their window, life went on, but inside, time stood still. Their parents, unable to control them, watched helplessly as their daughters became strangers. At 16, the Gibbons twins turned their obsession with stories into something tangible: action. They stopped writing and began experimenting with reality. They started small, stealing candy from shops, breaking windows, setting fires in empty sheds. For them, these acts weren't crimes, but performances, fragments of their imagined world brought to life. In their diaries, they referred to these incidents as the games, proof that they existed beyond their silence. But their rebellion quickly spiraled. One night, they set fire to a local tractor shop, watching in awe as flames devoured the walls. Their journals later revealed a chilling calmness about it. Jennifer wrote, "The fire was beautiful. It was our creation. For once, the world looked like how it felt inside us." Authorities could no longer ignore them. Arrested and charged with multiple counts of arson, the twins stood before a judge in 1982. During the trial, they refused to speak, sitting side by side with blank faces, their silence screaming louder than words. The press labeled them the Silent Twins, fascinated by their eerie connection and the mystery surrounding their speech. Psychiatrists diagnosed them with psychopathic tendencies, though no one could agree on the cause. The court, uncertain of how to punish two young women who seemed detached from reality, sentenced them to Broadmoor Hospital, one of the most notorious psychiatric institutions in Britain. It was a decision that would seal their fate, transforming their silence from defiance into tragedy. Inside Broadmoor's high walls, the twins' lives would begin to unravel in ways no one could have imagined, a slow descent into obsession, madness, and ultimately death. Broadmoor Hospital, a name that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who knows its history. Established in 1863 to house Britain's most violent and disturbed patients, it had long been synonymous with fear. Behind its red brick walls were men who had slaughtered their families, women driven insane by loss, and those the world had chosen to forget. And in 1982, June and Jennifer Gibbons, two silent, fragile young women, were delivered there like prisoners of their own minds. For the twins, Broadmoor was both a nightmare and a mirror. The long corridors, echoing footsteps, and iron doors became part of their ritual. They sat together in the day room, motionless, while other patients screamed or laughed to themselves. They spoke in low tones only to each other, their voices barely audible, a sound described by one nurse as like hearing secrets between ghosts. No therapy, no medication could reach them. The doctors were fascinated, yet deeply disturbed. One psychiatrist, Dr. Tim Thomas, wrote, "It is as if they exist in another plane, a shared hallucination, an emotional tether that binds them beyond reason." He noticed how their moods mirrored perfectly. When June smiled, Jennifer smiled. When one refused food, the other starved. When Jennifer was sedated, June collapsed into an identical sleep. It was beyond psychology, it was symbiosis. The staff began to fear them. Patients reported strange occurrences, whispers in empty rooms, lights flickering when the twins passed by. Though the hospital dismissed these as hysteria, those who worked the night shift said otherwise. One guard swore he saw the sisters standing in front of a locked ward, holding hands, their reflections appearing in the glass, but not moving with them. "They didn't cast shadows," he said later, pale and shaking. "They just watched me." But the truth was simpler and darker. The twins didn't need ghosts to haunt Broadmoor. They were haunting enough. Each day, Jennifer's health waned. She became slower, quieter, her eyes clouded by something unspoken. June's writing grew desperate, almost frantic. She began to write about freedom, about escape, about the unbearable weight of living as two in one. It was in these writings that the first hints of their secret pact appeared, the plan that would turn Broadmoor's silence into legend. As months passed inside Broadmoor, June's diary began to read like a confession written from the edge of sanity. Her entries bled with love and hate in equal measure, the kind of obsession that only twins could understand. "Jennifer is my shadow," she wrote. "She is the one who holds me down. I cannot rise unless she falls." Jennifer's journal, however, told a different story. Her words were softer, resigned. She described June as the stronger twin, the one destined to live. "I am tired," she wrote. "Tired of being her reflection. If I die, maybe she will speak." Each page felt like a slow surrender, a suicide note written in pieces over years of silence. The doctors noticed a shift between them. June began to interact, however slightly, with staff. Her eyes lingered longer, her movements seemed less robotic. Jennifer, in contrast, drifted into withdrawal, her health deteriorating for no medical reason. She slept for hours, her skin grew pale, and her pulse weakened. When asked if she was ill, she whispered, "No, I'm just waiting." No one understood what she meant, but June did. Their secret pact, whispered late at night between the rustle of hospital sheets, had reached its final stage. They believed that one of them had to die for the other to be free. It wasn't murder, it was sacrifice. And in their own way, both accepted it. The night before their scheduled transfer from Broadmoor to a lower security facility, a nurse found them laughing together, truly laughing, for the first time in over a decade. "It was beautiful and terrifying," she later recalled. "It sounded like children playing, but you could feel something ending." Jennifer's final diary entry simply read, "We have decided." The next morning, as the van carried them toward their new lives, Jennifer leaned her head against June's shoulder and whispered, "I'm going to have to die now." June nodded silently, tears streaming down her face, but said nothing. Hours later, when the van reached the new hospital gates, Jennifer was gone. No poison, no struggle, no explanation, just a silent heart that stopped beating at the precise moment they were to be freed. And as doctors tried to revive her lifeless body, June sat quietly beside her, whispering something only she could hear. "Thank you." The pact was complete. When the doctors declared Jennifer dead, June did not scream. She did not cry or resist as they took her sister's body away. Witnesses said she looked peaceful, eerily so. For a woman who had spent her entire life speaking only through the mirror of her twin, her silence now seemed like release, not grief. "I'm free," June murmured to one nurse, her voice trembling like a child learning to speak for the first time. "She gave up her life for me." Those were her first spontaneous words to another person in almost 2 decades. The staff stood stunned, after years of muteness. This was the moment they had begged for. But the price was unthinkable. Jennifer's autopsy revealed nothing conclusive. No toxins, no heart disease, no sign of trauma. The official cause was recorded as acute myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart, but doctors admitted privately that there was no medical explanation. It was as if Jennifer's body had simply obeyed her mind's final command, to stop. June, however, began to transform almost immediately. Within days, she spoke freely to nurses, laughed, even ate with others. It was as if a wall had crumbled inside her. "It was like watching a ghost come back to life," said one psychiatrist. She was reborn, but her freedom came wrapped in tragedy. When asked why Jennifer died, June's answers were unsettlingly calm. "It was meant to be," she said. "One of us had to go. We decided long ago. She chose to die so I could live." Authorities were baffled. The twins' case, once studied as a psychological anomaly, now seemed to border on the supernatural. Journalists swarmed their story, calling it the Pact of Silence. Scientists argued that their bond defied the known limits of human psychology. Were they mentally ill, or had they truly shared a mind? After Jennifer's burial, June visited her grave often, leaving small tokens, a pen, a notebook, a single red rose. She would sit for hours, whispering into the wind. Locals claimed they could sometimes hear 2 voices answering each other. Her journal entries changed too. Gone were the tormented passages of rivalry and resentment. Instead, she wrote of forgiveness, peace, and rebirth. "I feel light," she penned. "It's strange to be alone, but I can breathe." Yet, even in freedom, June never truly escaped the haunting presence of her twin. She once told an interviewer, "We shared everything: laughter, pain, breath. Even now, when I look in the mirror, she looks back." After Jennifer's death, June was transferred from Broadmoor Hospital to a lower security clinic. The staff braced for collapse. but instead they witnessed something almost miraculous. June began to talk, slowly at first, as though relearning the mechanics of speech. Words tumbled out clumsily, uncertain, but she did not stop. For the first time since childhood, her voice belonged entirely to her. Doctors described her recovery as spontaneous remission of mutism, though none could explain why it had taken the death of her twin to spark it. To June, the answer was simple. "She set me free," she said in one interview years later. "We decided that one of us had to die so that the other could live in the world." Outside the asylum, June lived a life both ordinary and haunted. She moved to a small Welsh village, got a modest job, and began writing again. This time for herself, not for Jennifer. Her stories were less violent now, but they still carried the same pulse of longing and guilt. In one unpublished notebook, she wrote, "Sometimes I hear her laugh in my dreams. Sometimes I think she's just gone to another room." Reporters tried to resurrect the legend of the silent twins, but June avoided attention. She never married, never had children. She said she was half a person learning to live as whole. Still, she carried Jennifer's diary everywhere she went, as if the pages were an extension of her own soul. Over the years, scholars analyzed their case as a tragedy of isolation, a symptom of cultural dislocation, even an example of twin telepathy. But none of those theories could touch the human ache at its center. The twins had invented a world to protect themselves, and when that world collapsed, only one was left to remember it. In her later years, June became an advocate for mental health awareness and the study of selective mutism. When asked what she wished people understood about their story, she said softly, "We weren't strange. We were scared. We made a promise too young to understand the cost." Jennifer lies buried in Haverfordwest Cemetery beneath a small stone that reads, "We two made one." June still visits from time to time, placing a pin beside the grave before walking away in silence. Because even now, after decades of freedom, that silence remains her first language, and her last connection to the sister who died so she could speak. In the decades following Jennifer's death, the story of the silent twins became a subject of fascination for psychiatrists, journalists, and artists alike. To some, it was a chilling case study in shared psychosis, what experts call folie à deux, or madness of two. To others, it was a haunting mirror of society's failure to understand the human need for belonging. June and Jennifer's silence wasn't mere stubbornness. It was a fortress, a language, a shield, and a weapon all at once. When journalist Marjorie Wallace met the twins during their Broadmoor years, she saw what doctors couldn't. Two young women with immense intelligence, humor, and creativity, buried under layers of fear. Wallace became their confidant, earning their trust and documenting their inner world through journals, poems, and letters. Her later book, The Silent Twins, offered a devastating look at the psychological maze the sisters had built and the world that punished them for it. Within their writing, Wallace found a recurring theme: love intertwined with destruction. Jennifer often described herself as the shadow, destined to die so June could live. June, in turn, wrote that she felt possessed by her sister's will. Their relationship oscillated between deep devotion and violent rivalry, a bond so intense that freedom itself became unbearable without the other. Psychiatrists who studied their case proposed that their extreme isolation began as a survival mechanism. As Black children growing up in a predominantly white Welsh town, the twins faced relentless bullying and exclusion. Their silence, some theorized, was an act of resistance, a refusal to engage with a world that rejected them. Over time, that defiance mutated into obsession. Yet, even among experts, no one could fully explain the psychic connection between the girls. When one fell ill, the other weakened. When one smiled, the other followed. It was as if their lives were stitched together by an invisible thread that no doctor could untangle. Their tragedy forced the medical community to question its assumptions about identity. Could two people truly share one consciousness? Or was their silence proof that trauma can reshape the human mind into something unrecognizable? For June, however, the fascination of others meant little. She once said, People want to study us like ghosts. But we were just two girls who wanted to be left alone. After Jennifer's death, June's silence gradually unraveled, but not into words of relief. Rather, into reflections filled with grief and guilt. She told Marjorie Wallace, "We made a pact. One had to die so the other could live." These words echoed through psychiatric conferences, university halls, and documentary films, baffling experts who had long tried to diagnose their condition. To June, however, it wasn't a diagnosis, it was destiny. As the story reached the public, the silent twins became a symbol of misunderstood minds. Their tale exposed the thin line between mental illness and emotional survival, between human connection and entrapment. Many called it madness. Others saw devotion. But those who read their diaries discovered something far more complex. A coded language filled with longing, jealousy, and an aching need for identity. Jennifer once wrote, "Without her, there is no me. Without me, there is no her. We are one." Films, plays, and academic studies would later try to capture their story, but none could fully grasp the eerie intimacy of their bond. The 2022 film adaptation The Silent Twins portrayed their relationship with sensitivity, yet even then, viewers struggled to decide, were they victims of a cruel system or architects of their own tragedy? June eventually found quiet independence. She began to write again, short stories and memoirs, though she never sought fame. Those who met her in later years described her as warm, intelligent, and soft-spoken, her eyes still carrying the weight of two lives. When asked if she ever felt free, June said, "Freedom is not what I thought it would be. I miss her too much to call it freedom." In many ways, the twin story is not one of horror, but of human failure, society's inability to see that silence can be both a wound and a shield. They were young girls trapped not only in each other's shadows, but in a world that refused to understand difference. Today, psychologists and writers still revisit their lives, not as a curiosity, but as a mirror, reflecting how easily empathy can be replaced by judgment and how isolation can twist love into something unrecognizable. And yet, perhaps the most haunting truth remains unspoken. Jennifer's death may have freed June, but it also ended a language no one else would ever understand. A world made for two, now reduced to one voice whispering into history. Before the silence became their prison, it was their refuge. The Gibbons family had moved from Barbados to Wales, and from the beginning, June and Jennifer stood out. They were the only black children in their school, quiet, identical, and foreign in a town that barely tolerated difference. Children mocked their accents, their skin, their stillness. Teachers tried to engage them, but the girls responded only with downcast eyes and murmurs to each other in a strange, melodic whisper that no one could decipher. At first, their parents thought it was simply shyness, a phase, perhaps, that would pass with age. But as the years went on, the silence deepened. June and Jennifer withdrew from everyone but each other, speaking in a rapid, cryptic language that blended Barbadian Creole, English slang, and invented syllables. It was their own private code, a shared world no outsider could enter. Teachers became alarmed. Social workers visited. Psychologists studied. But every attempt to separate them only made things worse. When forced into different classrooms, both girls froze completely, unable to move or speak until they were reunited. Together, they moved in perfect synchrony, walking in step, turning their heads at the same moment, their hands brushing like shadows tethered to one another. Their silence soon became an act of rebellion. They stopped responding to authority entirely, communicating only with glances and notes written in mirrored handwriting. Their bond was both mesmerizing and unsettling. The world saw it as pathological. The girls saw it as survival. Home was no easier. Their father, a strict disciplinarian, could not understand their world. Their mother, loving but overwhelmed, struggled between protecting them and pleasing the authorities. In the small, cold rooms of their Welsh home, June and Jennifer built stories to escape, stories of glamorous lives, dangerous love, and death. They filled dozens of notebooks, building fictional empires that, But beneath their imagination lay a growing darkness, envy, fear, and the realization that their connection, once a comfort, was slowly consuming them. Each began to dream of breaking free, but neither knew how. The idea of separation filled them with terror, the thought of remaining together with despair. In those early years, they were not yet the silent twins. They were just two lonely children trying to build a world of their own. And in doing so, they created a universe no one else could survive in. As adolescence crept in, the walls of their world began to crack. The notebooks that once brimmed with imagination grew darker, twisted by envy and control. June's stories were about freedom, about girls who escaped their confines, who found love and power in the outside world. Jennifer's stories, by contrast, turned inward, filled with death, dominance, and vengeance. It was as if they were riding against each other, their fantasies a quiet war. Soon, their connection shifted from unity to rivalry. June began to see Jennifer as her captor, the one who decided when they would speak, eat, even breathe. Jennifer saw June as the favored twin, the one who was subtly admired by teachers, the one who might leave her behind. Their diaries reveal the madness blooming between them. "She is my shadow," June wrote, "and I cannot live without my shadow. But I wish I could." Their relationship had become parasitic, two souls feeding off the other's silence. They began to engage in small, dangerous rebellions, petty thefts, acts of vandalism, setting small fires in empty fields just to watch the flames devour something other than themselves. It was the only language they could speak, destruction as communication. Authorities finally intervened. By 1979, after years of failed therapy, the twins were sent to separate boarding schools in a last attempt to break the codependent bond. The result was catastrophic. June stopped moving entirely, lying in her bed like a corpse. Jennifer became violent, smashing mirrors and tearing her clothes. The world outside was too loud, too invasive. They longed only for their silence, for the cruel comfort of each other. When reunited, they clung together even tighter, their communication reduced to whispered laughter and mirrored breathing. It was as though the world no longer existed beyond the two of them. Teachers called it psychosis. Doctors called it selective mutism. But neither diagnosis could capture the eerie devotion and dread that pulsed between them. They were now teenagers trapped in a private eternity, a place where love, hate, and fear all meant the same thing. What began as a survival pact had evolved into a curse, and the world, fascinated and horrified, had no idea how to help them. By the early 1980s, June and Jennifer Gibbons had crossed a line from silence into obsession. Cut off from the world and still teenagers, they spent every waking hour in their bedroom, constructing fantasy worlds through fiction. Both began to write feverishly, stories about doomed love, betrayal, and madness. They filled notebooks with vivid scenes of violence and redemption, their characters echoing their own emotional prisons. The sisters even began mailing manuscripts to publishers, convinced that their words would one day make them famous. June's first attempt, Pepsi Cola Addict, told the story of a boy seduced by his teacher and destroyed by love. Jennifer's tales, darker still, centered on family murders, arson, and jealous lovers who could not bear to be apart. Critics later called their writing brilliant yet disturbing, an eerie reflection of twin minds spiraling inward. But beneath the surface of creativity, danger brewed. The line between their fiction and reality began to blur. They started reenacting scenes from their stories, sneaking out at night, breaking into shops, stealing trinkets they didn't need. These crimes weren't about money, they were rituals. Each act of theft, each flame lit, was a way to feel something real in a world that had muted them. Then came the fires. In 1981, the Gibbons twins set ablaze a local tractor store. As the flames rose into the night sky, they stood hand in hand, silent, watching it burn. When police arrived, the girls didn't run. They simply stared, expressionless. When asked why they did it, neither spoke. But their diaries revealed everything. Jennifer wrote, "We burned it to see if we were alive." The act sealed their fate. The courts didn't see two neglected girls. They saw danger, an inseparable pair trapped in madness. At just 19 years old, June and Jennifer were declared a public risk and sentenced indefinitely to Broadmoor Hospital, one of Britain's most infamous high-security psychiatric institutions. It was a sentence that would define the rest of their lives. For the first time, the silent twins were surrounded by true madness, murderers, psychopaths, and the broken remnants of human cruelty. Yet even among the chaos, their silence remained intact. They refused to speak to doctors. They refused to speak to the world. They spoke only to each other. But inside those walls, their connection began to twist once again, this time towards something fatal. Broadmoor Hospital was unlike anything the twins had ever known, a fortress of echoing corridors, locked metal doors, and the constant hum of surveillance. Built to contain Britain's most dangerous minds, it was a place where time stood still, where daylight never truly reached the faces of those trapped inside. For June and Jennifer, Broadmoor became both their punishment and their sanctuary, a tomb of glass and silence. At first, doctors were fascinated. They observed how the twins moved in perfect synchrony, how they would mirror each other's blinks, even their breathing. When one refused to eat, the other starved in sympathy. When one wept, the other's tears would follow seconds later. Psychiatrists documented their every move, labeling them with terms like folie à deux, madness shared by two, but even that seemed inadequate to describe what bound the Gibbons sisters. Days became weeks, weeks became years. The outside world forgot them, except for the occasional journalist who called them the silent twins of Broadmoor. Behind the headlines, the truth was far darker. Their diaries from this period revealed obsession, jealousy, and the slow unraveling of their pact. June began to write that Jennifer was trying to possess her mind. Jennifer, in turn, wrote that June's soul was draining her life. They loved each other with a devotion so intense it became violence, a psychological war fought in whispers and stares. Inside their small, locked room, they built a universe where only one could survive. Jennifer began to tell staff that one of them had to die so the other could live. June agreed, reluctantly, fearfully, and the nurses noticed their growing fixation on death. They would sit for hours in silence, holding hands, eyes locked, as if rehearsing for the moment one would fade away. When journalists finally gained access in the early 1990s, they described the twins as ethereal, fragile women with haunted eyes who still spoke only to each other. But beneath their stillness was a decision already made. Jennifer told June she was ready to die, that her death would free them both. June, numb and broken, accepted the prophecy. On the morning of March 9, 1993, the twins were transferred from Broadmoor to a lower security hospital. During the drive, Jennifer leaned her head on June's shoulder and whispered, "At long last, we are free." Moments later, Jennifer collapsed. Her heart stopped without warning. June screamed for help, but it was too late. The doctors could find no cause, no drugs, no trauma. It was as if Jennifer had simply willed herself to die. When Jennifer Gibbons died that March morning, it was as if the world shifted, silently, invisibly, inside June's mind. The car carrying the sisters had not yet reached the hospital gates when Jennifer slumped against her twin, her eyes open but vacant, her lips trembling with what might have been a final word. The paramedics' efforts were futile. Jennifer was gone, her body lifeless yet peaceful, as though she had finally fulfilled an unspoken promise. The medical report listed the cause of death as acute myocarditis, sudden inflammation of the heart muscle, but doctors were baffled. There was no infection, no drugs, no trace of trauma. One psychiatrist said quietly, "She died of her own will." The statement was dismissed as poetic nonsense, yet everyone who knew the twins believed it. Jennifer had said she must die for June to live, and then she did. When June was questioned, she didn't cry. Her voice, rarely heard in over 2 decades, was soft but steady. "We had decided," she said. It was her choice. She told the staff that, for weeks before Jennifer's death, her sister had refused to eat or sleep. She had written final notes in her diary, promising June freedom. When the journalists later read those entries, one line stood out above all. We have decided that one must give up her life so the other can live freely. After Jennifer's death, something extraordinary happened. June began to speak. To the nurses, to her therapists, even to strangers. It was as though a lock had been broken in her mind. The girl who had once refused to utter a single word for years began recounting her life in vivid, painful detail. June described feeling a strange weight lifted from her chest, not relief, but clarity. She told one doctor, "I am finally free. Free to live. Free to die when I want, not when she says." But freedom came with guilt. For months, June wandered the hospital halls, staring at her reflection, whispering apologies to someone who was no longer there. Jennifer was buried in a small cemetery in Wales. June visited the grave weekly, leaving her notebooks and letters at the foot of the stone. Locals said she would sit for hours, talking softly as if her twin were still beside her. When asked why she did it, June answered, "Because she listens now. For the first time, she really listens." The world called it one of the strangest cases of shared psychosis ever recorded, a phenomenon where two people lose their sense of self and merge into one. But to June, it was simpler than that. "We were one person," she wrote later. "She took my silence, and I took her death." After Jennifer's burial, Broadmoor's heavy doors closed behind June one final time. She was no longer the silent twin, no longer part of a mysterious pair studied by psychiatrists and feared by nurses. She was simply June, a woman alone, released into a world that had moved on without her. Yet even freedom, when it finally came, felt strange and hollow. She stepped into the sunlight, blinking, unsure if she was walking into life or another kind of isolation. The press followed her relentlessly. Headlines called her the twin who survived and the girl who spoke after death. Journalists wanted answers. They wanted her to explain how Jennifer had died, why she had lived. June's responses were always quiet, almost detached. "It was meant to be," she said once, her eyes distant. "We both knew it had to happen." She was sent to a halfway house in Wales, where doctors monitored her recovery. For the first time, she had her own room, her own bed, her own mirror, her own voice. But solitude felt foreign. Nights were the hardest. She wrote in her journal that she would wake up expecting to hear Jennifer breathing beside her, only to realize the silence was absolute. "I am learning to be one person," she wrote. "It feels like learning to walk again." Over time, June found small joys: painting, walking, writing letters to her old doctors. She began to reconnect with her family, though the bond was fragile. Decades of estrangement had left scars that no apology could mend. Her parents aged quietly, haunted by guilt. They had tried their best, but society had failed their daughters long before the hospital did. Psychologists continued to study her case, searching for explanations. Was it a shared delusion? Childhood trauma? A desperate coping mechanism born of social isolation? None of the answers fit neatly. The truth, perhaps, was that June and Jennifer had built a world too fragile for outsiders to understand. Their silence wasn't madness, it was survival. In rare interviews, June would smile faintly when asked about her sister. "She's not gone," she'd say. "She just moved inside me." She kept Jennifer's notebooks stacked neatly in her living room, their covers worn, the pages filled with looping handwriting. To her, they weren't reminders of tragedy, but proof of their existence, two voices that had refused to be erased. Years later, when a journalist asked June if she ever regretted the pact, she paused before answering. "No," she said finally. "It was our choice. And when you've lived in silence that long, even death feels like a kind of voice." As the years passed, June gave rare interviews, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "People say we were strange," she once said, "but they never understood what silence does to a child. We didn't stop talking to the world stopped talking to us." Her words struck at the core of what had made their story so haunting. The twins were not born broken. They were made that way by the cruel indifference of a society that saw their silence as defiance instead of pain. June never married, never had children, and never left the shadow of her shared past. But in her solitude, she found something resembling peace. She painted scenes from memory, the sun setting over the Welsh hills, the schoolyard where she and Jennifer once stood apart, the faces of nurses and guards blurred into mist. Each painting seemed like an attempt to free fragments of herself that had long been buried beneath silence. In the years that followed her release, June Gibbons lived quietly, almost anonymously, in a small town in West Wales. She took long walks through the countryside, sometimes stopping by rivers where she and Jennifer had once dreamed of escaping their mirrored fate. Neighbors described her as polite but withdrawn, a woman with kind eyes who often seemed lost in thought. Few knew that behind her calm demeanor lay one of the most haunting psychological stories of the 20th century. Despite her silence, June began to rebuild a semblance of life. She worked briefly in community centers, volunteered at libraries, and kept diaries, hundreds of them, filled with reflections on grief, identity, and survival. Each entry revealed a woman learning to exist without her reflection, to navigate a world that had only ever recognized her as half of something whole. "I am not alone," she once wrote. "I am learning to listen to the quiet without fear." Meanwhile, the world had not forgotten the twins. Their story fascinated psychologists, writers, and filmmakers alike. In 1986, journalist Marjorie Wallace, who had befriended the sisters during their time in Broadmoor, published The Silent Twins, a book that would immortalize their tale. Wallace portrayed them not as freakish curiosities, but as victims of circumstance, two young girls trapped in a web spun by isolation, racism, and misunderstanding. The book shocked readers. People were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily society alienates those who are different. In the twins' story, many saw a mirror of their own unspoken loneliness. And for June, the attention was both a burden and a kind of release. She finally had proof that their story mattered, that Jennifer's life, however brief, had meaning. As the years passed, June gave rare interviews, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "People say we were strange," she once said, "but they never understood what silence does to a child. We didn't stop talking to the world stopped talking to us." Her words struck at the core of what had made their story so haunting. The twins were not born broken. They were made that way by the cruel indifference of a society that saw their silence as defiance instead of pain. June never married, never had children, and never left the shadow of her shared past. But in her solitude, she found something resembling peace. She painted scenes from memory, the sun setting over the Welsh hills, the schoolyard where she and Jennifer once stood apart, the faces of nurses and guards blurred into mist. Each painting seemed like an attempt to free fragments of herself that had long been buried beneath silence. Her art became her language, her way of rewriting the story she had once been forced to live. Where her diaries were confessions, her paintings were reconciliations, not with the world, but with herself. Through color and texture, she found meaning in things words could never express. Some of her works were later featured in small local exhibitions, though she rarely attended. Those who viewed them said the images carried an eerie stillness, as if time itself had stopped to listen. Today, June Gibbons lives far from the public eye, her story now a subject of films, plays, and university lectures. The Silent Twins has become more than a case study. It's a cautionary tale about the consequences of social neglect, the fragility of identity, and the cost of being unseen. Her silence is no longer her prison, it is her legacy. Perhaps the most chilling truth about June and Jennifer's story is that it forces us to question how many other voices have been lost to misunderstanding. Their silence wasn't madness, it was resistance, a language forged from pain when the world refused to listen. As one of June's final diary entries reads, "Jennifer lives within me. When I speak, she listens. When I sleep, she dreams. We are no longer silent, just quiet. And in that quiet, their story endures, not as tragedy, but as testimony. A haunting reminder that even in silence, the human spirit searches for connection. The days inside Broadmoor bled into one another. Gray walls, echoing footsteps, and the endless hum of locked doors. For June and Jennifer, time felt suspended, as if they'd entered a purgatory built just for them. They spent hours pacing in perfect sync, mirroring every motion, every breath, as if one body were split in two. The staff whispered about them in corridors, the twins who don't speak. Their silence unnerved even seasoned nurses. Some said the girls were haunted. Others thought they were cunning, manipulating the system through refusal. But those who looked closer saw something else: fear. Inside their diaries, fear bled through every line. Jennifer wrote of seeing her reflection move before she did, of feeling her sister's heart beating inside her own. June confessed that Jennifer's presence shadowed her soul, that every thought she had was already known before it reached her lips. They were no longer just twins. They were trapped inside a single, consuming identity. In Broadmoor, doctors tried everything: therapy, medication, hypnosis. Nothing broke their silence. When separated, both collapsed into violent outbursts, attacking staff or injuring themselves until they were reunited. Together, they became calm again, but their calmness was suffocating. It was as though they were communicating without words, their stares carrying conversations the world could never decipher. Yet something had shifted. Jennifer began to write differently, less about shared dreams, more about jealousy. "She wants me gone," she wrote. "She will live. I must die." June's entries mirrored the same dread. "We have decided," she wrote. "One of us must die so the other can be free." It wasn't madness in the usual sense. It was the logic of isolation, the mathematics of two souls crushed together for too long. Inside Broadmoor's stone halls, they began to plan something unthinkable, a sacrifice born from devotion. By 1989, after nearly 12 years behind bars, the twins were finally told they might be transferred to a lower security facility, a sign of hope. But Jennifer grew withdrawn, almost eerily resigned. She stopped eating, spoke softly to June, and often repeated, "It's nearly time." Nurses noticed she had become frail, her heartbeat slower, but no illness could explain why. The day of their release, the sisters rode together in a van bound for Caswell Clinic, their long-awaited freedom ahead. Jennifer leaned on June's shoulder and whispered something, words so quiet June never repeated them aloud. When they arrived, Jennifer didn't wake up. Doctors declared her dead on arrival. Cause: sudden myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. No drugs, no poison, just death without reason. June was left staring into the emptiness beside her, a silence deeper than any she'd ever known. She later said, "We had made a pact. One of us had to die. She chose." The death of Jennifer Gibbons sent a chill through Broadmoor and beyond. The staff who had watched the twins for years stood in disbelief. There was no medical explanation, no logical reason for a healthy young woman to die so suddenly. June sat beside her sister's body for hours, unmoving, her eyes vacant, her silence absolute. When finally questioned by the doctors, she said only, "I'm free now. Jennifer has given up her life for me." It wasn't spoken with joy, but with a hollow, grief-soaked certainty that terrified everyone who heard it. When the news broke, the press descended on the story like vultures. The silent twins, they called them, two girls bound by a deadly pact. Sensational headlines described them as witches, demons, or victims of supernatural connection. But to those who had read their diaries, the truth was far more tragic. It was a story of two girls who had been abandoned long before Jennifer's death, silenced not by curse or madness, but by indifference. After Jennifer's burial, June was finally released from Broadmoor. For the first time since childhood, she walked alone. The air felt strange, the silence unfamiliar. Reporters followed her through the streets, desperate to catch a glimpse of the surviving twin. But June refused to speak of the pact or the whisper in the van. Her grief was private, her silence now her own choice. There was no magic, she told a journalist years later. Just love, too much love. June moved into a quiet home near her family, but she rarely visited them. She spent her days writing, painting, and sometimes walking aimlessly through town, the same town that had once called her cursed. People said she smiled more, even laughed. Others said she seemed haunted still, as if half of her lived somewhere else. In her journals, she wrote about learning to speak again, learning to live with the echo of another voice in her mind. "I still hear her sometimes," June confessed. "In the wind, in the dark, in the rhythm of my own breath." Doctors who revisited the case debated for decades whether Jennifer's death was coincidence or something else entirely, a psychosomatic phenomenon, an act of will, or even a manifestation of the twins' unbreakable psychological bond. None could prove anything. All agreed on one thing. Their story was unique, unrepeatable, and deeply unsettling. Today, June Gibbons lives quietly, rarely appearing in public. She guards her sister's memory fiercely, refusing interviews except those that treat Jennifer as more than a curiosity. "We were not mad," she once wrote. "We were misunderstood." The world still remembers them as the silent twins, but their silence was never emptiness. It was defiance, a language of survival in a world that refused to listen. In the years that followed Jennifer's death, the story of the silent twins began to take on a life of its own. The media, eager to profit from tragedy, painted the sisters as eerie curiosities, two black girls who had retreated so far into silence that one died for the other to speak. Tabloids ran sensational headlines like "The Twins Who Made Death a Promise" and "The Pact That Defied Science." Reporters who had never met them spoke confidently about curses, telepathy, and madness. But none of them spoke about the racism, isolation, and systemic neglect that had shaped the girls' entire lives. June watched these stories unfold from the sidelines. Sometimes she clipped the articles and folded them into notebooks. In the margins, she wrote quiet corrections, not demons, just girls. The more people spoke about the silent twins, the further the truth slipped away. Their silence had become entertainment, their pain a spectacle. In 1986, journalist Marjorie Wallace, one of the few who had earned the twins' trust before Jennifer's death, published a book titled The Silent Twins. It contained excerpts from their diaries, intimate thoughts, and poems they had written during their confinement. For the first time, the world saw beyond the myths and into their inner world, a landscape of beauty and torment, love and fury. Readers were stunned. The diaries revealed girls desperate not to vanish, but to be understood. In Jennifer's diary, the darkness was palpable. She wrote, "We have become fatal enemies in love, blood sisters eternally." Her words burned with jealousy and devotion, as if she knew her own fate. June's entries, meanwhile, were full of longing. She wrote of freedom, of guilt, and of the unbearable weight of being alive without her twin. When asked about the book years later, June said, "It wasn't madness that killed Jennifer. It was the world that refused to let us be." As the book gained international attention, filmmakers and psychologists descended once more. Documentaries were made, some sincere, others exploitative. In one, June sits before the camera, eyes lowered, hands trembling slightly, and says, "It took her death for me to live." It's a line that echoes through every retelling of their story, both tragic and profound. But even as the fascination grew, June withdrew further. She stopped granting interviews, stopped engaging with reporters. "People want a ghost story," she told a friend. "But this isn't about ghosts. It's about what happens when no one listens." The silent twins were no longer flesh and blood. They had become folklore, symbols of madness, obsession, and the unknown power of human connection. After Jennifer's death, psychologists, linguists, and sociologists all turned to the case of the silent twins as if it held the secret key to human consciousness. Their peculiar private language, a rapid, mirrored form of English mixed with Caribbean slang and invented syntax, was no longer dismissed as childish nonsense. Researchers began to study it as a rare linguistic phenomenon, a cryptophasia, a twin-only communication system that develops when isolation and shared imagination fuse into one mind. Recordings of June and Jennifer's speech, captured during therapy sessions, revealed conversations so fast and fluid that no outsider could follow. Words blended, sentences curved back on themselves, and laughter often punctuated moments of silence. Some experts described it as a defense mechanism, a way to shut the world out. Others thought it was a rebellion, language twisted into armor. Whatever it was, it gave them control in a world that offered them none. Their teachers had once labeled them mute. Yet, in truth, they were overflowing with expression, just not in a language the world recognized. Their notebooks, later found by journalists and psychologists, were filled with pages of fiction, plays, and imaginary kingdoms. In one story, a boy is killed by his jealous twin. In another, two girls ascend to heaven after making a pact to leave the earth behind. These writings blurred fantasy and reality, love and annihilation, mirroring their own lives too closely to ignore. As more scholars studied their case, debates emerged. Were June and Jennifer victims of an environment that crushed individuality? Or were they two minds so intertwined that separation itself became an act of destruction? Some theorists compared them to literary doubles, Jekyll and Hyde, Dorian Gray and his portrait, reflections of a shared identity doomed to collapse when forced apart. Others saw in them a symbol of colonial trauma, daughters of immigrants caught between cultures, punished for being different in a rigid white institution. June, when asked about their language, said softly, "It was never meant to be secret. It was ours. There was no magic, no possession, only two girls creating meaning in a world that refused to hear them." Even decades later, linguists play the tapes of their voices in classrooms and conferences, trying to decode the rhythm and emotion embedded within. The words may not translate, but the feeling always does: longing, fear, and a desperate need to belong. In many ways, the story of the silent twins became more than a case study. It became a mirror reflecting society's failure to understand difference, to listen before labeling, to help before isolating. Jennifer and June's silence was not a mystery of madness. It was a protest no one recognized until it was too late. By the late 1980s, the doctors at Broadmoor had grown divided over what to do with June and Jennifer. Some believed the girls were dangerous only to themselves, too fragile for the prison-like asylum that housed Britain's most violent offenders. Others, however, feared what might happen if their strange, unbroken bond continued unchecked. The twins had become a paradox, obedient yet unpredictable, compliant yet utterly beyond comprehension. Their silence, once considered a symptom, had become a form of control. They no longer screamed or lashed out. They simply watched. And in that quiet, something darker stirred. June had begun writing about escape, not from Broadmoor, but from Jennifer. In her diary, she described their bond as a sinister shadow. Jennifer, she wrote, had become possessed with death. In return, Jennifer's entries turned more prophetic. She wrote that one of them would have to die so the other could live. The girls began to speak of it casually, like one might discuss the weather or an approaching train. The psychiatrists dismissed these conversations as metaphorical, twin language for emotional separation, but the girls' eyes told another story. Their words had begun to shape their fate. That winter, a doctor overheard them whispering a vow. "We have decided. One must die." The staff didn't understand the seriousness of what they'd heard. After all, the girls had been making strange declarations for years. But something had changed. Jennifer had grown weaker, sleeping for hours, her skin pale and clammy. June described her sister as fading. And yet, Jennifer refused to see the infirmary. "It's my duty," she told June. "I'm going to have to go first." In March 1993, the authorities decided to transfer the twins from Broadmoor to a lower security hospital in Wales, a chance at a gentler life, perhaps even freedom. On the day of the move, Jennifer rested her head on June's shoulder and said, "At long last, we're free." But as the van rolled toward the new hospital, Jennifer slumped forward. By the time they arrived, she was dead. No cause could fully explain it. The autopsy revealed a sudden inflammation of the heart, but no poison, no trauma, no clear medical reason. The doctors called it a mystery. June called it destiny. In her diary, she later wrote, "We made a pact. One had to die, and she chose herself." Jennifer's death was quiet, eerily fitting for a life spent in silence. But for June, it was both release and ruin. In the hours after Jennifer's death, Broadmoor's corridors echoed with an unfamiliar stillness. Nurses whispered, psychiatrists argued, and June sat motionless on her bed, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. When asked how she felt, she said softly, "I am free at last." But then her voice broke, and the words came again, trembling. Free at last, but empty. The staff, who had spent over a decade trying to interpret the twins' silence, now struggled to make sense of June's sudden clarity. For the first time in her life, she spoke in full sentences, calmly, lucidly, as though the presence that once bound her had dissolved. She told them that she and Jennifer had always known one would have to die for the other to live. "We couldn't be two," she said. "We were trapped in one body split in two." Her confession was delivered without tears, just an exhausted understanding that what had happened was not murder nor accident, but the completion of an unspoken covenant. Psychiatrists called it folie à deux, a shared psychosis where one mind dominates another until both lose themselves. But June's account hinted at something deeper, something primal. For her, it wasn't madness. It was release, the quiet end of a bond that had become both prison and identity. After Jennifer's death, June's transformation was immediate and haunting. She began to speak openly, engaging with staff and journalists. Her writings grew more coherent, grief-stricken, yes, but free from the coded metaphors that had once trapped her language. She laughed for the first time in decades. She walked the hospital gardens alone, whispering prayers to a sister she believed still lingered somewhere near. When she was finally released from psychiatric care, she returned to Wales, a solitary woman who had survived the impossible. Yet freedom brought no peace. June visited Jennifer's grave every week, laying 2 flowers, one for her sister, one for herself. "Because half of me is buried," she would say. Locals sometimes saw her walking along the cliffs at dusk, speaking softly into the wind, as though continuing a conversation that had never truly ended. In interviews, June often repeated a single line. "We spoke in silence, and silence destroyed us." The world called their story strange, tragic, even supernatural. But June called it love, the kind that consumes, confines, and ultimately demands a sacrifice. The world outside Broadmoor was quick to claim the story of the silent twins as its own, twisting tragedy into fascination. Newspapers called them voodoo twins, possessed girls, and the most mysterious sisters in Britain. What had been a lifelong struggle for autonomy was recast as spectacle. The public devoured their silence like a ghost story. Headlines exaggerated their every movement. Twin speaks only to twin, deadly pact of madness. The truth, 2 girls crushed beneath misunderstanding, was lost amid the noise. When journalist Marjorie Wallace entered their lives, she uncovered something the tabloids ignored: their writing. Hidden beneath the hospital beds were notebooks filled with dreams, anger, and longing, vivid worlds where the twins escaped their suffocating reality. Their stories were dark, sometimes violent, but painfully human. They wrote of love, envy, and guilt, of trying to exist in a world that refused to see them as individuals. Wallace, moved by their words, described them not as monsters, but as 2 halves of one soul desperately trying to be whole. Yet even she admitted the media's obsession was unstoppable. Once the world decided what the twins were, cursed, insane, unnatural, no truth could undo it. Their faces appeared in magazines beside lurid titles. Strangers speculated about demons and witchcraft. Few saw 2 black girls crushed under the weight of racism, isolation, and a system that treated their silence as pathology instead of pain. After Jennifer's death, this fascination only deepened. June's survival became a symbol of freedom, of madness overcome, of tragic genius. Publishers begged her to release her diaries. Filmmakers offered money for her story, but June hesitated. She feared that every retelling turned their suffering into entertainment. Still, she agreed to collaborate with Wallace, who published The Silent Twins in 1986, a haunting book that forced readers to confront the cost of misunderstanding difference. The diaries revealed a chilling honesty. Jennifer had once written, "We have become fatal enemies in love." June's entries mirrored the same torment. "She thinks I'm possessed. I think she's cruel. We are trapped in each other's shadow." Their words became evidence of a deeper psychological war, one where love and hate had no boundaries. As time passed, June withdrew from the spotlight. She stopped giving interviews and refused public appearances. She wanted Jennifer's story to rest, not to be dissected endlessly by those who could never understand what it meant to live in mirrored confinement. When asked why she remained silent now, June simply said, "Because silence is the only language that can't be twisted." The irony was inescapable. The twins who were once punished for silence had their truth buried beneath 1,000 voices. Years after her release, June Gibbons lived quietly in West Wales, near the sea. Locals knew her only as a quiet woman who walked alone at dusk, her coat pulled tightly against the wind. Few realized that she was one half of a legend whispered across generations, the survivor of a bond that blurred the line between devotion and destruction. In the evenings, she often stood by the cliffs, staring into the horizon as if speaking to someone unseen. "She's still with me," she once told a neighbor softly. "She never left. She's just quiet now." June's solitude became her peace. After decades of institutional walls and watching eyes, silence was no longer punishment, it was protection. She began writing again, not as this silent twin, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. Her words no longer carried the manic tension of childhood. Instead, they were meditations on grief, guilt, and survival. She wrote of Jennifer's laughter, of the nights they whispered stories to the moon, and of the crushing guilt that still lingered, the knowledge that she had lived while Jennifer had not. In interviews, June spoke sparingly. She never blamed anyone outright, not her family, not the doctors, not even fate. "We were two children who built a world no one else could see," she said once. But every world has its breaking point. To some, her calmness seemed eerie. To others, it was a woman's quiet defiance after surviving the unthinkable. As years turned into decades, the myth of the silent twins only grew darker. Documentaries, plays, and even musicians borrowed their story, transforming it into art, sometimes compassionately, often sensationally. But behind every adaptation was the same unsolved ache. Why did Jennifer die? And what truth lay buried in their silence? Scientists speculated about psychological fusion, about selective mutism, about shared psychosis. Yet June rejected every label. "We weren't mad," she wrote in a letter never sent. "We were unseen." By the late 2000s, June had grown almost ghost-like to the public. A few researchers tried to reach her for interviews, but she declined them all. When one journalist mailed her a copy of the latest film adaptation, she returned it unopened. The words "Some stories belong to the dead" scrawled on the envelope. Still, those who met her in person described a strange calm, as if she had finally made peace with the shadow she could never escape. In her garden, she kept a small stone engraved with Jennifer's initials, JLG, beside a single white rose bush. Every spring, the flowers bloomed unevenly, one tall, one short, always side by side. To June, it was enough. "We weren't cursed," she once whispered to a friend. "We were just too close to heaven." In the years that followed, scholars, psychologists, and writers tried to decode the mystery of the Gibbons twins. Were June and Jennifer victims of a rare psychological disorder, or of a world that refused to understand difference? Experts coined terms like selective mutism, twin dependency syndrome, even shared delusional identity. But none of them truly captured what happened behind those locked stares and long silences. Every diagnosis seemed to erase their humanity. Two girls turned into a clinical curiosity. Their diaries tell a different story. They speak of fear and tenderness, of laughter that dissolved into madness. Jennifer once wrote, "We became one, but one of us had to die." June, reading that years later, said it was not a confession, but a prophecy, one that both of them felt was unavoidable. Their silence had been their shelter, but it became their curse. They had hidden from cruelty, from racism, from ridicule, but in doing so, they built a fortress so strong that neither could escape. The tragedy of the silent twins lies not only in their isolation, but in the way the world responded to it. No one tried to understand them, only to fix them. Doctors prescribed medication. Teachers sent them to institutions, and newspapers called them ghosts in human form. Yet behind the headlines were two children longing for love, belonging, and the simple freedom to exist on their own terms. The twins' story became a case study, discussed in classrooms, psychology journals, and true crime programs. But beyond the theories and sensational headlines, their lives remain a warning about what happens when empathy disappears. June and Jennifer's silence wasn't madness, it was rebellion. Their world, strange and secret, was a response to a reality that offered them no place. Society had isolated them, and in return, they created a private kingdom where only they could rule. When June was asked in her later years whether she forgave the world that labeled and confined them, she smiled faintly. "There's nothing to forgive," she said. "They couldn't see what we saw." Her voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent between worlds, one real, one imagined. The journalist interviewing her described her tone as both gentle and haunting, as if she still spoke with someone just over her shoulder. Even today, psychologists debate their story. Was it a shared psychosis, a bond too powerful to break, or a metaphor for every unseen child locked away by misunderstanding? Perhaps it's all three. Perhaps, as June once wrote, our silence was the only way to survive in a world that never listened. What remains of June and Jennifer Gibbons is more than a psychological case. It is a mirror reflecting the cost of silence. Their story forces us to ask what happens when the human spirit is starved of understanding. The silent twins were not demons, nor anomalies. They were two young girls who built a world to protect themselves from one that never welcomed them. Their silence was their armor, their language a rebellion, and their destruction a tragedy written long before they could read it. June still visits Jennifer's grave every year. She brings fresh lilies, the same kind their mother once placed on their childhood table. Sometimes she reads aloud from their old notebooks, her voice steady, as if reciting prayers. "We wanted to live," one entry says, "but not in their world." June whispers the words like a confession, and then, for a moment, she smiles. In her rare interviews, June often speaks of Jennifer not as gone, but transformed. "She's part of everything now," she says. "The air, the wind, my thoughts." It's as if death never truly separated them. It only made their unity invisible. Their story endures because it touches something ancient, the longing to be seen, the terror of being misunderstood, and the fragile line between love and madness that every human heart walks at least once. The silent twins are buried in history, yet their presence lingers like an echo that refuses to fade. Teachers still whisper about them, psychologists still argue about them, and filmmakers still chase their story, trying to capture what no one ever truly could: the language of their silence. Their tragedy isn't just about mental illness or obsession. It's about the hunger for connection and the violence of neglect. On Jennifer's tombstone, the inscription reads, "We once were two. We two made one." It's a line that encapsulates everything: the love that bound them, the silence that consumed them, and the destiny that tore them apart. When you walk away from their story, it doesn't feel finished. It lingers, like the echo of a whispered secret you can't quite forget. June's quiet survival becomes its own haunting, proof that some silences are never truly broken, only carried. In the end, the silent twins were not cursed nor insane. They were two souls who found the only language that would listen: each other. And in that fragile, forbidden language, they found eternity.